Hello, everybody. We are back with another episode of the H2O show. I got my friend Eli Clark. We are outside at where is it? How do you say it?
Holocron? I don't know.
We don't know.
But right near the Thinkery.
Oh, yes.
Like, it's right behind.
And we're sipping on some amazing hot chocolate.
It is really good.
This was a great. Gotta hit you with the cheers here.
Yeah.
This was fantastic.
Thank you.
So I think it was very interesting, and I want to jump right into this.
Yeah.
I thought it was kind of random, but so we were talking about Washington State.
Yeah.
And you were talking about your interest in neurobiology. And I was just sort of curious if you could tell us a little bit about, specifically, where do you want to go in neurobiology? And sort of what's that draw to Washington State?
So, for me, I first got interested in neuroscience when I had this 7th grade teacher who, used to be a high school teacher, and he taught the things that the school was supposed to teach, but he also, he actually cared about education and learning and curiosity. So sometimes he would introduce things that weren't going to be taken for a grade and stuff that were maybe higher concept as an introduction. So he talked about neurotransmitters, right? And, it's interesting about that and with chemicals. And, doing a lot of my own research, I'm currently in psychology, and anatomy and physiology is a way to do that and get more into that. But I specifically have wanted to focus on mental health and or chronic pain in relation to neurological things for that. So for me, I see that in a lot of research capacity, and I guess if you're looking, it would be more likely to see in the behavioral, because I see myself doing research that has interactions face to face with human subjects, which you don't have a lot of. So it would be not behavioral, cognitive, yeah, because with other things there are parts of neuroscience that specifically molecular biology, apparently they don't even use technically, they'll have made in a lab things to work on it. And you might have in behavioral, you might have some with more complex animals and stuff and examining behavior. But for me, I think people are really interesting and stuff, and I mean that can be good and bad, but I think that's interesting. And looking at, we can learn a lot more about mental health and about chronic pain conditions, neurology, and because of the stigma around it, I think that it is an important thing for us to focus on and to further to have a better grasp on it and to be able to help people more and to be able to address where we have ignorance and address and keep that from harming people in the process of trying to get help or figure themselves out.
Well, it's very interesting, and I remember this being talked about a lot. It's sort of right now there's sort of a big, I don't want to say debate, but definitely sort of a riff in sort of the treatment and analyzation of mental health. Because I noticed that some scientists are very much hey, mental health is a lot of it is regarding the physiology, right? You'll hear the classic hey, this patient has either depression, anxiety because of a chemical imbalance or something like that. And you'll see in the clinical aspect a lot of hey, you have depression, anxiety. Here, let me give you some drugs. So let's try to get this in balance. And then you sort of have the other side of the spectrum that no, this isn't really a physiological thing. It's more of, environmental factors and it's not, oh, you're lacking, serotonin or dopamine. It's somebody in your family died or something like that. And then obviously there's the majority of people who say, hey, let's look at this sort of in both lights.
Yeah.
And I was just kind of curious on your thoughts. What are your thoughts about sort of our current the current lenses on mental health and mental health issues?
Yeah. Well, I think I agree. Having both is important because there might be things that are more just genetic, but even if we're just looking at genetic components, right, having any mental illness for some amount of time, even if you start to balance it with chemicals, I think what people don't understand is that for people, mental health medication isn't really the type of medication you kind of wean off. for most people, if you're not having something like, if it is a very specific, like, stressful time period in your life, or like if you have anxiety with flights, like, then you may not be taking anxiety medication every day. But for specifically genetics, like, it's a lot of managing it. And even with non-genetic situations, like, you know, there generally is with situational, like, there's also an imbalance in chemicals as well. So, like, medication is very important for that and stuff, but it is also important for therapy and treatment, things like that, because again, even with the, you know, medication, it doesn't cure it. And especially if you've been going for some years untreated, or maybe in some treatment but it wasn't working, there may be negative thought patterns or habits that you've picked up that, you know, it can be harder to work through on your own and stuff. And I think that's one of the big important things of therapy, is there's a lot of ways it's used. Like, I think a lot of people just see it as like, oh, talk about why I'm sad, and like, that is true, like, they do have that, but like, there's also specific skills. Like, they might be like, hey, here's how to cope with this emotion, or hey, you're in distress, here's a way to do this, or like challenge thinking patterns, which is like also why I think therapy is good for people even without like necessarily having a mental illness, because therapy can be very helpful in a lot of life skills. So I think a little bit of regular therapy would not be bad for people, but I definitely agree that you have to have both, and like both are important, and that, like, you know, medication is important and we shouldn't just rule it out, but we also need to keep in mind that medication and therapy is like the best way to handle it, and the best way when we look at it and how we discuss it, like seeing that yes, this does have physiological components, so medication is important, but it's also important to see how that relates to our behavior and our thinking patterns, the things that may not be as, you know, clearly seen than, you know, other physical things.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's interesting. I mean, I think, and what's kind of interesting too, and you kind of brought this up too, is, you know, the goal, like, you know, the medication that you're taking for mental illness is very different than sort of the medications that you would be typically taking for a physical illness, right? It's a different realm.
Well, what I would say is, again, so if you, for example, if we say you have anxiety on planes, right, you might have a specifically prescription medication for anxiety that you only use then. And there might be health conditions you have that you might only take as needed, like maybe an inhaler, right? You're not necessarily using that every single time. But there are things, so like cholesterol issues or thyroid issues, you also are taking medication every day, because, you know, there's going to be an imbalance. Like, I think that's the thing, is that why it's important is the sort of thing is, if you're taking medication for a cholesterol condition, if you stop taking medication, your cholesterol is going to go back.
South, yeah.
So I think that a lot of people, it's harder, if you compare it that way, it's easier to see that, like, it acts as a sort of preventative and stuff, and removing it, the effects it had while there aren't going to, like, last indefinitely. Like, if you don't have it, then the, like, brain chemicals will still be unbalanced. Even if you're getting therapy, like, you might be able to deal with the mental illness better. But just like, again, like with cholesterol or thyroid, like, you might try some more at-home methods that are not medication and might make some parts of it not as bad, but not taking the medication is going to leave you back in that bad spot. And so, like, I think it's important in discussing, like, this is why, like, medication is important. And because a lot of people will talk specifically with mental illness medication and discuss and be like, oh, we'll change your brain chemistry, but that's kind of the point, because if it's not helping maintain a steady balance, then it's hard to do the things you want or need to do and stuff. And similar again with, like, thyroid or cholesterol, like, if you stop taking that medication, you know, you're not changing your body chemistry anymore, but there was a reason you were changing in the first place. Like, you're not going to get enough thyroid stimulation, so you're not going to be able to, like, your quality of life may decrease, and it might be harder to do things day to day because, you know, you have all these symptoms, and because of the body being off balance.
And I think, yeah, I mean, I think that's interesting. I mean, it's interesting because, I mean, when I look at the medical literature, there are some, I mean, there's a significant amount of the community that's like, hey, you know, let's use using drugs more in that long term span I mean, but there also is physicians who say, like, hey, we want to institute medicine more as a crutch and then sort of pull it back as time, or at least attempt to pull it back as time goes on. And what works, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, again, this can differ person to person, and obviously I don't have a doctorate degree, but, like, from my experience, I think we just need to think about how we think about mental health medication. Like, I don't think thinking of it, like, I think when doctors think of it as a crutch, like, I think that can have some of that, like, negative connotation and make it harder to see that, like, it's not a crutch for a lot of people. Like, you can go to therapy and you can have all the skills. Like, there's a lot of people who will do their best, or people I've known who, like, situationally, they're like, I have a good home life, I have a good school life, like, there's nothing else, and I just cannot, I'm still really depressed, and I'm still having this. And, like, they have access to therapy, but, like, again, part of it, there's still chemistry there. And again, like, maybe there are some people, if it is definitely more situational based, like, there might be a situation where you wean it off, or, like, there may be experimental things. Like, I know there's been people discussing about, like, ketamine, and I don't know a lot about that, but people have been discussing that as a possible, like, depression treatment, and, like, having that done in a way that would be used in a temporary fashion to ideally, like, hold longer term. But for a lot of things, a lot of the medications, like, if you don't take it daily, it will be a thing. And, you know, and that's also a thing you can see when people randomly, like, if you just stop medication or go cold turkey, a lot of things are bad, because not just is your brain chemistry messed up, but, like, and, like, missing those components, but, like, yeah, a lot of them have long half-lives that stay there because, you know, they are needed for extended thing, you know. So doctors may have different opinions, but I think not seeing medication as a crutch necessarily, because, like, you can be doing everything else right, but if they're being, yeah, again, similar like with thyroid issues, you could be eating the great diet, you could be exercising, but if your thyroid's not in control, then it's not going to matter. You're still going to gain weight. You're still going to have X, Y, or Z issue.
Speaking of experiment, I don't know if you've heard about this. This is really wild. I did see this recently where there was some work being done on, so, like, back in the day, back when we did absolutely no idea what we were doing.
Right. Yeah.
There were they essentially were trying to use shock therapy as a viable treatment system, and of course they had no idea what they were doing.
Mm-hmm.
So they were putting a lot of probes in random places, and they were using way too much voltage.
Oh yeah.
And let's just say none of that went well.
Well, no, yeah, no.
But now there has been some physicians who are using. I want to be very careful because there's definitely a stigma around shock therapy.
Yeah.
But essentially, they've started saying, like, hey, like, you know, basically stimulating different areas of the brain via a much lower frequency of, and I don't even want to use shock. I just want to say a low frequency charge. And just kind of putting it through the brain. And have you heard of this?
Yeah, so I've heard of this, and I did know someone, I think, who had sort of it one time. I didn't really know her very well before or after, so I think there definitely needs to be more research into it. Like, I have heard of people looking at the brain and doing more, like, vibrations and targeted and stuff, but I think we also do need to be careful because of the fact that there are some people who are still proponing shock therapy for autistic people. So I think we're still very much in that new phase, because there is a situation of, when talking about it, is this someone who's trying to look at this from a general mental health aspect and actually doing this not as a punishment, but, like, with some science, versus the fact that a lot of people will still try to use bogus science to be like, oh, well, if we shock autistic people, they won't have autism, which is not how that works and stuff, and, like, unfortunately still a thing. So, like, I think there definitely needs to be more research on it, and very much making sure that we keep the distinction between them clear, because of the fact that, like, being very careful, because these people who are still, like, shock therapy is still legal in multiple, like, states in the U.S. for, like, to like shock autistic people. Like people think that's okay and like not based on any scientific thing, especially because autism is not a mental illness. Like those are completely different things. So I think research, like I've heard a little bit about it, but I do think there needs to be like deeper research and making sure that like we are looking at real science and making sure that these people like who do the research make sure they clarify this is specifically we are doing it in this lower way for this thing and stuff. This is not to be used for, you know, this should not be used on autistic people. This should not be used as a form of punishment, you know. So
because I was very unfamiliar. What is going on there?
So
Could you walk me through that a little bit?
There's a lot of things. So there's been various residential schools and across the country and stuff, and in other places. But there was, oh God, I'm trying to remember it. I want to say it was like Judge Rittenberg or something. I can say your name later. But there's been this center, and there's been multiple centers that specifically are like, oh, we take in, you know, autistic children to help them. But still now there's a lot of stigma around autism and how people view it, so people will think that you can punish it out. So shock therapy is still being used in that way, not necessarily because they think if I put this on the brain it's necessarily going to change it, but it is more used as a punishment.
So they're essentially bringing these children into the clinic itself.
Well, like there's like residential centers, like people will be like, oh, it's a house too. Like, you know how when, I don't know if you remember U.S. history, how like Native Americans were put in like residential boarding schools. So there have been some schools sort of like that for autistic people where they were like taken away from their family, or other schools. There's been a lot of cases where people are facilities for troubled teens, but what they consider troubled is varying from like, oh, this is an actual mental illness or homelessness to this person was too
promiscuous.
Yeah, according to some standard, and not having the proper people to deal even with people who have like mental illness. So like this is a thing that's not just autistic people, but autistic people and, you know, other disabled people are hurt by this a lot. And specifically with autistic people, like there is shocking, and I think there's also what's not as talked about is ABA,
which is
so it's a program, and they're trying to rebrand themselves, but it's still not wrong. But the idea is trying to train out autistic behaviors and stuff. And so the problem is that it views autism as something that needs fixing. There's autistic people generally, like, there's an autistic pride movement in this sort of thing, because there are various things that can be difficult and, like, you know, may need help with, right? Like having being able to have devices to be accessible for people who are nonverbal, right? Or being able to have accommodations to help with sensory overload. But some people will, you know, like induce and try to punish people who are even stimming. And stimming is like, if it's not harmful, you know, if someone's flapping their hands because they're happy, that should be fine. But because this person is autistic, they're physically and emotionally punished to the point that they stop doing that. And so I think it's really hard.
And really quick, when we're talking about punish, so, and I'm sorry, I really want to make sure, just so that we are on the same page here. So essentially, you know, a child who has autism is being put in, you know, whether it's a school or a housing facility, and essentially it's, if they're not, you know, if they're exhibiting, you know, let's say sensory behavior or whatever, they're shocking them, and it's pure, the shock is given for pain purposes?
Yeah, so shock is not everywhere with ABA. It's just, I mean, the ideas behind them are the same and stuff. So there's not as many, shock is not as common as ABA, because ABA can happen in a non-residential sense, and there's actually a problem that most autistic organizations that are supposed to help autistic people, which is, you know, when you don't actually ask autistic people, like, it's that whole thing, are in favor of ABA, and they are trying to say, oh, it's changed now. So, like, in the shock, that's also pain for, like, that's used for punishment, not to do it. And these people just think that these behaviors need to go in ABA. It's like these behaviors need to go. So while they may not be using shock necessarily in the majority of cases with ABA, they might do various things, like physically or emotionally, like causing the child distress or like punishing the child for such behaviors, so the child does stop doing the behaviors. And the problem is when that happens, whether it's with ABA or shock therapy, people like to say, oh, then there's no more autism, which isn't the case. It's a survival mechanism at that point in time. You know, like anyone, if like every time you talked you were like abused, it wouldn't be like, look, suddenly this person doesn't talk. Like, it wouldn't be a good thing, or wouldn't be because necessarily, oh, finally we got rid of your vocal cords. It was that like you would learn that this like leads to bad consequences, and so it can be really hard. And I think with ABA in particular, because that's a lot more common, right, and a lot more not seen as bad as shock therapy. Like, people, obviously that's bad, and some people still think it's acceptable, but it's definitely seen more unacceptable than ABA. So the problem is that a lot of parents are like told and like scared into thinking ABA is a solution, and thinking that their kid can't have a good life if they don't do ABA, which is not true, you know. And so I think that's something that's been a really big issue and still is, because it's so common and it's really hard to get ground there, because again, it's hard to warn parents not to when the majority of resources you can find easily are ABA. Then it seems like, and if they're like, oh, well, your child won't be able to do this or this and this without this, you know, they get scared, when it turns out like a lot of autistic children they find later on are more traumatized and are worse because of ABA. Like, they...
What does ABA stand for, really quick?
Here. I should know it.
No, you're all good. No, I was just curious. I was like,
yeah.
What is that?
Like, I know I should. Oh, let me see.
No, this is awesome. I had no idea this organization even existed.
Well, ABA is like a... here. ABA is like a method, right?
Oh,
so
okay.
It's something that's used in a lot. So it's applied behavior analysis and stuff. So yeah, their idea is that if they say it that way, but like train out this autistic behavior and it will be better in the long run, but it's not. Like, it's a really difficult topic, and again, I think also with autism in particular, like, there's still so much stigma and false information. Like, you know, like, that's part of the reason, like, I have a website that I've been writing articles on.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, so currently, so it's activelytired.com, but
what's it called again?
Activelytired.com.
Okay.
So it's supposed to be a website that has articles written by disabled people on disability topics for disabled and non-disabled people, right? So there might be things that are sort of supports, or things that, like, hey, if you're disabled yourself, like, you know, recently I wrote and plan to upload one on noise canceling headphones to be like, hey, so if you have sensory issues because of something like autism or some other neurodivergence, like, you know, here's what it's like, here's what they're for and stuff. And so, like, part of that's also supposed to be used as education, because there's a lot of times where people, like, I don't believe a lot of parents who put their kids in ABA officially or think about it they don't necessarily know what they're doing. Like, that doesn't mean that this is an okay thing, but I think part of the problem is because there's so much ignorance specifically around the disabled community in a lot of aspects. It's really hard, because with a lot of other social justice stuff, people are like, well, Google it, you can find other sources. But the problem is, when you Google, the most easiest search results you find are from non-disabled people who, like, some might have more vicious motives, some might also be ignorant and are just spreading it on and stuff. So, like, the point of the website is supposed to be able to get a lot of voices who speak and are like, hey, so here's the thing, like, as some information to, like, give that, and to hopefully, like, fight some of that ignorance, and hopefully, like, get rid of some of the ableism that may be intentional or unintentional because of such information.
And so this is really interesting, what sort of prompted you to get, because I know you're also, now remind me, so Eli and I, we both go to LASA,
yeah.
And you're a member of, it's, what's
so, it's RAMP, so Raising Awareness for Mental and Physical Disabilities.
And I'm very interested, what got you sort of involved, like, what made you say, like, hey, like, I'm going to start a website for this, I'm going to get involved in a club, like, what kind of got you involved in that?
Yeah, so as, like, a sort of background, like, I had found out, like, my freshman year of high school, like, I was having a lot more struggles, and one of my teachers was like, maybe it's dyslexia, you know? And so, like, there was whole trying to get that diagnosis, and specifically with COVID, and the way it hit, like, I had barely had my dyslexia accommodations in place, and like that was already after they had like delayed giving. They had been like, oh, you're dyslexic in October of 2019, and I didn't get accommodations till February of 2020, which is a ridiculous amount of time considering they had the diagnosis. And but the problem is with that late thing, and they shut evaluations down. College Board denied my request for accommodations for dyslexia for the AP. So for me, the accommodations, like I also do have like anxiety and stuff. So it's breaks that's needed for anxiety and 50% extra time on reading, math, or writing things. So basically any test you take, because of the dyslexia. And so we were told there was no way we could change this because, again, it had been in for less than a month, and you need usually 6 weeks, and my teachers could not say I was using it then because that was in 2020 when classes weren't even real, right? Like assignments weren't real, so there was no teacher doing timed assignments, so there was not even online being like, well, I don't see them in person, but there's timed assignments, so it was difficult. So like I failed that test, and I failed like my WAP AP, and that was really hard for me because it's like I tried this hard and stuff, and like I had a diagnosis. They had it. It was from AISD. Like, this was not me. This was not, like, the College Board had sufficient things. And so, and AISD was still being unhelpful with evaluations, with trying to figure out those. And it got to the point that I was thinking, like, if I didn't get the accommodations in place for my APs my junior year, then I'm just not taking AP tests. Because why should I pay $50 or stuff, or, like, an exorbitant amount of money for a test that I'm going to fail regardless of how hard I do study? So I contacted and reached out to Disability Rights Texas, and so they have groups all across the country in various places, that deal with disability rights cases and various things. So they'd helped us in figuring out. They had said, actually, there is a way to appeal to College Board. And so, like, I had to reach out to all my old teachers from, like, who had actually taught me in person, and I had to basically be like, hey, listen, so I know when I had you, I might not have had the full dyslexia diagnosis, or like, or like, because I already had a 504 for like anxiety and stuff like that. So being like, hey, would you be willing to, like, here's things that I specifically remember in your class that might have been indicative of dyslexia or anxiety. Like, could you be willing to write and, like, confirm or say things you saw, like, it was a very, like, I had to send, and I had to send personal emails to each teacher because I had to be like, hey, specifically, because what it looked like in different classes, differed, right? Like, me not filling in the, like, misspelling words from the word bank on geography tests might not be when you talk to, like, geometry. Like, that's not exactly, that has to do more with numbers. So, like, that was a harder process, but we were able to get those accommodations in place. And then I was supposed to get an evaluation for, like, various other things and looking at things like that, and hopefully expanding also on, like, using four-function calculator, because one of the biggest reasons I originally was like, I'm having trouble with things like dyslexia were numbers. Like, and they just didn't think it was important to address that, even though that was, like, one of the chief concerns. So I worked with them and filed a complaint with TA about the delayed evaluation because they weren't communicating with us. They were able to work out volleyball games and stuff, but they could not figure out how to do an evaluation for one person. And, like, that was really frustrating, because, like, there's a lot there, but they could not figure out how to schedule, like, 3 hours for me and one other person to do that. And I was not the only one with that issue because near the end, suddenly they added on another kid from AISD that was completely different, like, demographic. Like, elementary school kid, completely different from where I live, like, different issues. And so, like, TEA agreed there was a delayed evaluation, so we were able to get that expedited to try to get that. And, like, so I was able to get the calculator accommodation and get access to, like, Bookshare to get more books for dyslexia and things like that. So, like, I think for me that was a really difficult time fighting for those things and dealing with that type of ableism. And that's actually, like, when I started to find Ramped and stuff. And, it's still a weird thing because at the time I was like, well, I'm facing this ableism, I'm working with Disability Rights Texas, but I'm not actually disabled. Like, it was a situation like that, like, thinking about that language. And, like, one thing I will say with the pandemic is that being online, right, you find more communities and stuff. And so, like, finding the disabled community and talking to people, at Ramped and seeing that, like, being able to understand that and myself better and stuff. And also seeing, like, like I was having chronic pain and fatigue and, like, it was getting worse. So, like, I've now been diagnosed with fibromyalgia, which is a chronic pain condition. So it's basically, from what they understand now, is that my nervous system overfires. So one of the ways it was described to me is, when you're cooking, sometimes the smoke will set off the alarm, right? But there's not actually a fire that needs solving. So, like, that's kind of my body all the time. And so sometimes if I gently tap something, like, for most people, they might not even notice it, but I tap it and it's like, hi, you're being stabbed now.
Oh, so you'll have so almost like your nervous system will overreact. So, you'll touch something and it's a severe response.
And, like, that's one of the things. But, like, it's also, like, I am in, like, pain all the time. And, like, it's not great and stuff, but, like, I think that was also really important in trying to find that community when I was, in pain. I was still trying to get a diagnosis, and, like, again, it's a difficult thing, I think, especially because when you look for advice or groups online, they're a lot of times for adults, even, like, young adults, they're, like, not for high school students or not for people who are, like, even barely adults, and so, like, I think that made it hard because you don't have that community as easily, or there's also lots that are very religious based, so, like, that can be very isolating too if you're like, okay, but, like, I don't believe in, like, this God.
And I want to take a step back. So were you always having, like, was this a condition that you dealt with growing up, or did it just sort of onset?
So fibromyalgia, again, like, it's still one of those that's misunderstood, and because of the type, it's harder to see on definitive tests. So it's a lot of times more like, here's these symptoms, and it's not shown to be this because of blood tests and stuff, then it's this and stuff. So, but one of the things is genetics and, like, stress. So, like, I did have some genetics, and, like, I had some lower pain when I was, like, starting when I was a teenager and stuff. And then, like, I had some, like, extra stressors and, like, some, like, big physical injuries, like surgery. Like, I had foot surgery when I was in 7th grade, and it was soon after that I started getting wrist pain. And so it started to be, like, originally it was just my left wrist, and I had played French horns. They're like, oh, it's carpal tunnel. But then it wasn't, and so then the doctor was like, and I was like, oh, now I'm having it in both hands, and he's like, oh, it's just growing pains, you're fine. So, like, it just happened that, I had, like, another, like, big physical, like, health thing at the end of 2019. So, like, that triggered it further. So, like, in 2020, the pain started to get worse, which was one good thing about being at home, is it's a lot easier to go lie down or use heating pads and stuff. So, like, I don't know, it wasn't as prominent throughout my childhood, right? But, like, it's definitely since, like, I was 13, so, like, for the past 5 years or so, like, think more and more. So it was really 2020 where, like, I started to get to the point where, like, I could definitively say I was in pain every day and things, and being able to say these areas are always in pain. Sometimes I'll also get pain other places and stuff. So, like, which is why, like, in 2020 it became a lot more urgent for me, because, again, there was various ways that I talked about chronic pain and stuff, and, like, those weren't the answers and stuff. So, like, once it started to be more full body and there wasn't like there was nothing physically wrong with my wrist or anything like that,
and how, because I find, pain is one of those things where, it can be very beneficial. I think there's a lot of, I think a lot of times it's like, oh, you're in pain, and people sort of shy away from it. And they're as crazy as it sounds, generally there can be, pain can sometimes be a beneficial thing at times. But obviously when you're having pain in this situation, I mean, it sucks.
Yeah.
And, I would assume it's also very draining, right? It's mentally. So how are you sort of, just out of curiosity, if you're willing to go into this, how are you, what's that pain management like? And then, how are you managing sort of the auxiliary things of, like, keeping your energy and, like, stuff like that, if that makes sense?
Yeah, and, like, a lot of chronic illnesses come with fatigue, but also it's true, chronic pain does fatigue you because of that energy. So depending on your condition, different things can work. So There is one medication that I use for sleep that can, in low doses, help somewhat with fibromyalgia pain and stuff. So for me, a lot of what I do is, so there's desensitization. Like I said, like sometimes my body will overreact. So desensitization. Oh my god, I can't speak.
English is a ridiculous
It's great. It's okay. Got the dyslexia. Yeah. But so like for that, it's basically doing some sort of gentler touches or some sort of like pressure and things like that to try to get your body to be like, hey, here's a touch like this. Like, this doesn't mean you're necessarily like having an injury and stuff, which like doesn't completely get rid of it and stuff. And like it definitely is tough doing, but it's supposed to in the long run help some. So like for me, desensitization can be like using a massager. It might be like you'll have like this pretty soft like scrubby brush like you could use as a thing, or like doing like gentle like pressure touches and stuff. And so like that's one of the ways for fibromyalgia in particular that's a thing. And then other things is because I also have like other random things, like apparently I have hypermobility even though I'm very inflexible, which is like kind of the double jointedness. Yeah, which is like a weird thing. So apparently like that's messed up some of my walking and stuff and things like that. So like I've done some PT and OT and like doing some regular exercise. Like I think it's important to say, like with fibromyalgia and a lot of other pain conditions, it's chronic, it's lifelong. Like I think what's important is understanding, like I think the important thing is figuring out how to manage it day to day and like how to have less bad days and stuff. Like I think that's my goal and what I think a lot of people should be, because I think a lot of people falsely say, oh well, if you just do this, this will cure it, which can like often be wrong. But also I think that, for me, like I do find like doing some PT and OT exercises, doing some desensitization, and trying to conserve my energy. So like what I actually would use, and I don't know if you've heard of this, is there's the spoon theory.
Oh,
so
Please. So this was something that Eli talked to me about. It was actually, you presented
Yeah.
And so definitely go over this, because I think this is very, very interesting.
Yeah, so there is this person and her friend talking at a diner, and like she had like a chronic illness, chronic pain condition. I want to say it was lupus, but again, a lot of chronic illness is same in having chronic pain and chronic fatigue, and like trying to explain to her friend like, yeah, like going to the doctor and stuff, and like I have limited energy. And so she used spoons because she was at a diner, and so she's like, so you have 12 spoons, okay, in a day. Let's say this one is to get out of bed, this one to get dressed. You have a doctor's appointment, that's 3 spoons. So like what's meant to show is that people with chronic illness generally have a limited amount of spoons or energy. So each action costs something. So something easier, like maybe just getting out of bed or getting dressed, if that's not super difficult for like any other reason, like that might cost 1 spoon, versus going to school all day, like that might cost 4 spoons. So it's a way that people use to gauge and measure their energy, and the idea being that like you do have limited spoons, and what happens is when you have a chronic illness and you don't have unlimited spoons, like people who who have that energy and have those spoons and like don't have to worry about running out of those necessarily, like you can run a deficit, and that can be really bad. Like you'll feel very tired and fatigued, you can't really do a lot, which is like why it's an important thing to talk about why it's like, oh, I can't do that much necessarily in a day, or why like it might be hard for people to grasp the idea. I'm like, oh yeah, I have a doctor's appointment, so like I'm basically not doing anything else today. Like a lot of people may not understand that like going to school and going to a doctor's appointment and being like other than this, I'm basically just gonna sit and like try to get some energy back and stuff. So I think that's a very important thing for gauging that, and it can be really hard, especially in schools like LASA, but in life in general, because again, most people don't have limited spoons. So for a lot of people, it can be hard to understand like it might seem ridiculous, but like for me, sitting on my computer playing Sims might be too many spoons versus me just lying down and watching TV. Like for a lot of people, they might be like, well, both of these aren't actually like, difficult tasks. These are both things you like, but like it's weird to be like, no, I can't do this other thing I like even if I want to, because like the energy it takes. So like Yeah, which is like,
Now, is there a way? So, let's say you have a person who, let's say they wake up and they have 10 spoons, right? Like,
Yeah.
that's their energy allotment of the
Yeah.
day. Through, essentially, is there a way where, through diet, through exercise, through, sort of environmental factors, we can get that, we could have that person wake up, at some point and not have those 10 finite spoons, but maybe get their energy up to 13, 14, right? Can we?
Well,
is that a thing?
I think, I mean, if you're having some things that might help with the pain. So, for example, if I'm having less bad days, then there's less days that you wake up with less spoons. I think it's more, maybe not more spoons, but making sure you have a stable amount of spoons and don't lose spoons. Because if you get bad sleep, or if you're sick, or if, like, for example, if cold weather specifically triggers that, like, you might actually wake up with less spoons. So there might be things that, like, again, because it can't be cured. So there might be things that help you manage that does give you more energy. So, like, again, like, exercise does not cure chronic illness and stuff.
Right.
But for some people, it might help with some of the pain, or it might give them some more energy. So they may not lose spoons over that, or they may have less bad days where they lose spoons. That's what I feel for me is having less bad days. Is there's less days I have that I have even like a lower amount of spoons and have like very problematic about how to schedule them. Like, I think it's a lot of like thinking very carefully about what you're doing, and there's times you can't control it. Like, if you wake up and for some reason it's a bad pain day, like, it sucks. Like, you don't necessarily have a decision in that, and I think like that's something that can be hard to explain to some people, again, especially because sometimes it can be like, and this is also like a problem where people, like dealing with people who have like chronic illness might appear flaky and stuff because of canceling plans last minute. But like sometimes, like, I know a while back, like, I woke up and like I thought like normal amount of spoons. Like, I don't calculate it as strictly, but like I do keep in track of like my energy levels. So I might be like, okay, there's this, and like I had like another thing planned that day, but like I had planned my spoons, and I was like, oh, in between this thing and this thing, I'm just gonna lie down to get some energy. And in the time, like, I left the first thing to try and get home to lie down, for some reason, like, my pain decided, like, it got really bad.
Yeah.
So, like, I ended up not being able to go to the other thing, which sucks because, sometimes things happen and there's not really a way to prevent it, right? Like, in that situation, it was not that I overexerted myself or that I...
Just sort of happened.
Yeah, well, because I wasn't even at the point where I was like, well, I know after this I'm probably going to be tired, so it might be harder for me to get work done. But it ended up where, like, well, I don't go to that thing, and so, but I'm also not going to get a lot of work done because that also requires energy. So I don't know if that answers your question, but like, yeah.
Well, I mean, basically what you're saying is you're saying that, like, hey, the goal is let's try to live in a way that it's like, on a grand scheme of things, you're keeping sort of the same amount of spoons.
Yeah.
You're trying to limit the amount of days where you have less spoons than normal.
Yeah.
And try to sort of maintain a consistent amount of energy.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, that can still be hard because and stuff. And I do think it's also important, like, this is like sort of off topic, but still a thing that, again, there may be things that might help some, but I think also part of the problem is, and what I say is that other people don't mean to, but a lot of times when non-chronically ill people talk on chronic illness and what they think will fix it, like, there may be things that help, but like, they're not gonna cure it. And like, I think that's a false thing to like prove that, but also a lot of times people will say as like an easy way to put it on someone else, and like, that's not necessarily fair, because again, like, there's situations where you can be doing everything like quote unquote right and you're still chronically ill. Like, I think that's a concept that is hard for some people to get and stuff. So I think understanding that, like, also when people are managing spoons, like, as much as you're like, oh, well, if you just do this then you would have more spoons, like, understanding that that's not necessarily true, and also like what can help some people for chronic pain is different than others. Like, mine's more neurological, right? So things that help, like arthritis, things like that help autoimmune or inflammatory conditions.
Well,
Yeah, which was an issue because at some point people were like, oh, maybe like juvenile arthritis, but like the inflammation stuff never worked for me because I didn't have inflammation in that way. So like I think that's also like a lot of the person figuring out what works best for themselves and what helps them manage it and have less bad days. I think like that's also an important thing, like being able to listen to that person, because it might seem like, oh well, if you do this, and they're like, okay, but like for me that doesn't help. So
no, I mean, I think that's very interesting, and I think it's important to say this too for audience members. It's like, you know, and this isn't just for people dealing with chronic illness. This is for all people too. You're going to have bad days, right? Like that is perfectly normal.
yeah,
You know, I think we live in this era now, and you know, I think social media perpetuates this, and just sort of general culture where it's like, you know,
Always
every
on the
day-
grind.
Yeah, everyone, you know, you're just nailing it all the time. You know, you're living at a 10. You know, life is fast and furious.
Yeah.
And the reality is, it's like, no, like you're gonna have days where you're on it. You're gonna have days where you wake up and you're like, ah, crap.
Yeah.
And, you know, and both of those positions and everywhere in between is perfectly normal and
Yeah.
and perfectly okay.
yeah, I think that's definitely a thing, and like without going all the way into socialism, but like that's a lot of things. If when we look at capitalism, like I think a lot of times when people critique it, especially disabled people, like they're saying that part of the problem is like what we consider lazy or we consider weak, like, you know, isn't necessarily true. Like that, you know, again, and it hurts also non-disabled people. Like it might less appear, but it's true. If you're like completely burnt out all the time because you continue to work and stuff, so you have like a day where you can't do anything, like that doesn't mean you're lazy. You're human and like you need breaks. And it's a problem because a lot of society treats it as like you should just keep working. If you have burnout, that's your fault, and you should just keep working through it, which is unhealthy. It's unhealthy for disabled people, but also for non-disabled people. Like, it's just not good.
Well, and I think it's tough too, and this is, you know, something, you know, as an athlete, like there are days where like you do not want to train, right? And those are days where, and this is like 90% of the time, it's literally because you're being lazy, and this is a reality. Like, you know, you get tired, you're like, oh, I don't really want to do this, but then, you know, you do the warm up, you get involved, and it's like, hey, your body's fine, you're good to go, and you just kind of push through. And on those days, like, you know, I think it's very important that, like, hey, I know you're kind of, you know, but, you know, kind of push through, get through that warm up and go. But that other 10% of the time, you know, you'll do that warm up and you're like, crap, like this is just not going. And I would say those are like, don't ignore those moments.
Yeah.
And this isn't just for an athletic perspective too. You know, whatever your pursuits are, if you're kind of like, I'm tired, you know, and you put in the work.
Hi.
What's up?
Hi. Those are my parents and my little brother Gareth.
Hi. My name is Jack.
Okay. No, I know. Yeah.
What a legend.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. That child brings me joy.
I know.
I love children. They're awesome.
He's great. He's great. When we saw it, he's like, ooh, fire. And stuff. He likes it a lot.
Yes.
There's in Judaism, because I'm Jewish, like there's like what you call like near to meat, or like an everlasting flame that's not supposed to go out. So in modern temples, that's, you know, electric, not fire, because whatever and stuff. And everyone's always hated it because they're like, it looks like snakes, but like he is in love with it and stuff. Though we're gonna have to unfortunately get a new one because anti-Semitism was a thing. Because like someone committed arson not that long ago at CBI.
Whoa.
Yeah.
Wait, where? Whoa, hit the brakes. Hold
Yeah.
on. So, oh my god, I had no idea. Wait, in CBI, is that that's not JCC, is it?
No, so that's Congregation Beth Israel. So like because you were here as a freshman, yeah?
Yeah.
Yeah, so you know like the world cultures trip to like each of the things?
Yes,
so
okay,
the
okay.
temple we went to, like that's my temple.
Oh,
and
okay.
there's multiple, but like it's one of the bigger ones. So like, yeah, back on Halloween, someone set a fire to the front, and like the the building, I mean, like, we still have some, yeah, but, like, the front and the main sanctuary has had some things, and there's been things. They caught the guy and stuff who was, like, dumbass person, and I say that not just because of, like, anti-Semitism, but also he kept in his car a journal where he's like, I set the synagogue on fire, like,
nice.
And he also had put, I told my mom, which
Sweet.
means she's an accomplice because he was caught because the security cameras caught the license plates of his car as he's leaving, which is why you pay money to the synagogue to have, good security, but, like, it's not great, but the good news is that, like, there's been more media attention, so we're getting donations, because there's an issue between, like, fire damage versus things that were, like, part of an older building that now because like building codes are a thing, like same with where we're at Lhasa, right, that originally like the school was fine, but like once you check it, like the new building codes now apply, like you can't be like, well, when it was built that wasn't a thing, now it's a code, so you do have to like fix it. So it's
what's crazy too, because I asked this because there's the neighborhood around, so and for those of you who don't know, so in Austin there's and what's the name of your synagogue again?
Congregation Beth Israel.
There's the Congregation Beth Israel Synagogue, and it is a beautiful synagogue.
It is.
I sometimes on my cycling route, I'll cycle across and I'll see. I always see this one, like 65-year-old woman kicking ass, just like gardening. The gardens are beautiful.
They very much are, yeah.
But there's another synagogue. And it's really a group of synagogues in this one kind of plot of land, and then around it is a neighborhood that is predominantly Jewish.
Yeah.
And a neo-Nazi group recently was in this neighborhood, and they brought a sign. And sorry, like I felt it's horrible, but it was also kind of funny in a dumb way.
Yeah.
Was they had the sign that said "Vaccinate the Jews," which, from a public health perspective, you're like, yeah, let's not get disease.
Yeah.
But obviously, when you look at it intent-wise, it is a horrible statement.
Well, yeah.
And it was like, what's,
I mean, I remember someone at, like, our youth group saying, actually, that, like, back when vaccines were more, like, rolling out, right, and now for, like, teens that then, at that time, like, back in May or so, that they had gone to, like, UT to get it, and, like, there's people protesting, and it was, like, don't assimilate yourself with, like, incorrect, and, like, information, don't get the vaccine, like, don't be, like, indoctrinated in it, and, like, being like one, and that was technically only like one person and stuff. Like there's a lot of things like that, but yeah, it is the intent that's like really problemsome, and I think that like it's a thing. Like I think we are seeing some rise in anti-Semitic things, which is like really unfortunate, and like not great, so it's like, and like even in Austin, because there was like things at Anderson, like weeks before that, like they're actually not connected because that kid was going to Texas Tech, so like that was, I mean, now he's not going there because obviously got expelled. You don't commit a hate crime and a felony and be like, well, you can still be a student here.
Well, and I saw this, and this was extremely concerning. There was a poll. There were some researchers who were looking at that. There's a growing idea in the United States that the Holocaust didn't happen. And I have to say this. What the fuck going on there? Like, that is absolutely insane.
Yeah, it's a thing, because a lot of the rewriting of history, and I think also part of it is, like, and as hard as this is, obviously, I would say the older you get, then maybe it's just because we're in Austin and there's a more liberal population, but, like, understanding that a lot of the things you're taught in school about history aren't the full truth, right? And I think that part of the problem is that, like, what we don't talk about is the fact, like, America had a chance to take in more Jewish people, and they didn't, and so those people, like, as a result, did die in camps, and were in camps, even if they survived, and it's a sad thing, and that really the reason we had to be not okay with anti-Semitism is because, like, when we got involved in the war as an ally, like, a lot of people during that time were very much anti-Semitic, and very much were like, yeah, eugenics, and stuff, so, like, but it is baffling to me that people, like, want to say it's not real. Like, I think, a lot of it, like, denying that stuff, but also the fact that there is so much so many people like spreading conspiracy theories and people like supporting, like there's a lot of things where people are like, oh, you have to teach both sides of history about the Holocaust. Well, there's the sides of not genocide and genocide. Like there's not a book that we should be like, yes, here's the thing about like, you know, someone who's in a concentration camp, but you should also have a book from someone being like, but the Nazis weren't that bad. Like there's not two sides to history, and same with slavery. So like it is really frustrating to see that people are like have these conspiracy theories and are like, oh no, the Holocaust didn't exist, when it very much does. And like it's important to acknowledge it happened. There's people still alive who were in concentration camps, and that like it, and how it affects like the world today, because like it didn't happen in a bubble. Like it's the Holocaust still has so much effect on like things today.
Now, for people who don't know, one of the, I believe it's the Israeli Ministry of Defense, their like logo in Hebrew, it is written out in the, I do not know Hebrew, but I know the translation of it is never again.
Yeah.
And that never again, what they're referring to is very clear.
Yeah, it's a Holocaust, because it's like, I mean, to be fair, like a lot, it's a joke in Judaism that most holidays are someone tried to kill the Jews, they failed, let's eat food. Like it's true, a lot of the Jewish holidays are basically that format, is there was something, but like, you know, the genocide, like it definitely is like such a big thing, and that we can't let it happen again. And the problem is, you know, like the saying that like if we don't learn from history, like it will repeat itself, right? Like that type of thing, you know. And like that's the thing, is like when people deny the Holocaust, like then it means some things like this can happen again, because again, it's not something that should have happened, it's not something that should happen again. And when people deny it, then like it takes away the reason like why we say never again, never forget, like all those things. Like it's not something that should have ever happened.
Yeah, and I think it's so, and I mean I remember when the Holocaust is one of those events that when you think about it, like it sounds preposterous, like it's such the magnitude in which it was conducted, the sheer brutality of it, I think is, I mean it's I mean I think it is complete, like it is so outside the normal human construct, and like who we are as human beings. And I think the fact that people are trying to deny that it happened is just, I mean, as you said, it's frightening, and it's dangerous in the sense that it's providing sort of a gateway of, oh, let's just repeat it, you know?
Yeah.
And that's a very it's something to be very mindful of.
Yeah, well, because it's like a lot of these people who don't want to remember it, like they don't want to confront where they could be wrong or about things like that. So if they try to make you forget, like, you know, being like it's not that bad, then my anti-Semitism, my like hatefulness, like that's okay, and it's not, you know, and it's being used as like, you know, like you said, leads to that path, leads to things like this happening, and leads to like, you know, such inhumanity and stuff, and like it's not something that should happen, but like it did, and people should not try to forget it because it sucks, but like we can't avoid it, and if we do avoid it, then we're not doing it justice, we're not doing ourselves a favor.
Well, and it, you know, it's very interesting, kind of over the past year, you know, we've seen a lot. I mean, you know, we saw the pandemic, and it brought a lot of things back to people's forefront, right? You know, a lot of people came to the realization of like, oh shit, like America still very much has problems regarding race.
Yeah.
And oh shit, America still has, you know, homies that think they're just in the Confederacy, you know, like it was a strange, I think it was a very rough but necessary reminder of the fact that though our society is trying to move forward and try to better itself, there is definitely still evil within it.
And people still, and I think, again, like I mentioned earlier, some things good about the pandemic is there's finding some online communities, right? But, like, that also can be bad, because it's where people were doing fear-mongering and having this hatefulness that, like, such a small voice that, like, might not have otherwise been seen, like, was able to be listened to by all these people in their homes who, like, didn't question it, and, like, led to a lot of the things we see, you know. So, like, you know, there's people who learned, again, like, people having that harsh reminder and reminding them again and again that, like, the U.S. is not fair. I mean, the world in general is still shitty in a lot of ways, and that too, but, like, the U.S. has a lot of issues with the justice system and with race and with how we view white supremacy and our ideas on democracy. Like, you know, I think you're right. Like, I think the pandemic very much brought out the worst in some people and in a lot of people, or at least people weren't able to hide it from it as more, because when you're inside and there's less distractions, like, I think that's part of the thing, because a lot of people found self-discovery, and that's great. And then, you know, some people decided to join QAnon, and so that's not great, you know.
I remember watching, I was in Mr. Snyder's, he was my English teacher last year. I was in his class, and I remember, like, sort of paying attention to class, but more paying attention to the news, because this was when the Capitol was being stormed.
Yeah, the insurrection.
And I remember the image, this was the first time I saw it, where the guy was in the buffalo suit in the House of Congress. And I truly sat there, and the first thing that went to my mind was, did I eat a mushroom? Like, am I smoking crack? Like, what planet are we on? Like, it was so... I mean, well, just, like, the way the man was dressed, it was so...
It was
absurd.
And, I remember I left my English class because my English teacher was like, it's fine, we don't need to stop class because of the insurrection and stuff, because, again, when it was online, my third period class ended early. So, and again, I remember first seeing it before, like, it was blown up on social media or anything, and sitting there, and, like, my mom saying, you know, like, this is, like, the type of moment of, like, remembering when, like, other things have happened, like hearing about Columbine and things like that. Like, it was that sort of moment that you're sitting there and you're like, it feels unreal, like, that this is happening, and, like, you can't look away and stuff, which you also shouldn't look away, because as awful as it is, we very much need to pay attention and make sure that we're not like, well, this is an okay thing to do, because it's not. Like, it very much is one of those things that, like, out of things you expected to happen in 2021, not what you'd expect, and, you know, not in the U.S., which I think is also another thing. A lot of people have been like, you know, U.S. is like, oh, we're great democracy, but I think a lot of people have seen with things like the insurrection and other things, and, like, being able to look and see that what is viewed as democracy may not be, like, what we've been told, because you can say we're great and we're democratic, and then things like the insurrection happen, and some of the ways that people have dealt with it is, like, not what you would do. And but it was definitely one of those intense moments that you, like, was unbelievable, but, like, you know, happened, and, like, you saw, and now, like, that's a part of our reality now, like, something that people will learn and have the same thing, you know, like, one of those, like, changing moments in history that, like, you know, again, like, when we hear of other events and we're like, oh, what would it be like to live in a historic time? Like, we're kind of in that with the pandemic, with the insurrection, with, like, the bigger Black Lives Matter movement.
Yeah. No, I think you're right. And, I mean, no, I remember, I did stay in that class, believe it or not. Mr. Snyder, but we looked at it, and it was, that was a wild day. And I think it definitely, Hi!
Hi, dog.
Over here. Yeah. That is a beautiful dog, by the way.
Yeah. Oh, little cute doggy. Yeah.
But yeah, I just felt like, you know, that was a very, that was a strange day.
Yeah.
And I want to say this, and this is something that I think is very important, and is not really talked about. You know, I genuinely like the United States. Like, I enjoy, I feel, I'm very happy that I live in the United States.
Yeah.
You know, I think the United States has done a lot for me, and I think that I have done a little bit for it, but as I grow older, we'll definitely do more for it. But I think one thing is one of the greatest forms of patriotism one can do for their country is acknowledge where the country is going wrong and make attempts to fix it. Right? I think blind patriotism is not the way to go. Right? I think you should look at your country and acknowledge what it does right, what it does well, but also recognize where it's falling short and attempt to address that.
Yeah.
And I think that 2020 did a good job of showing us where we are falling short. And I think now we're sort of in the time of kind of like getting ourselves back together. And I hope also we start kind of really taking that time and making steps to sort of rectify the issues that were sort of brought forth.
Yeah.
Or, I don't want to say brought forth, but brought to light. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, for me, it's really hard to see myself other than in the U.S., but I think part of that's because I have trouble learning other languages, and a lot of places are that and stuff. But, like, yeah, I think this and before that it's really hard. Like, I don't know. I don't know how much, and maybe in the past I did have some of that blind patriotism like you do when you're a kid and you're told the, version of U.S. history that, like, is nice and pretty for white people, right? Like, that's a thing and stuff. And learning more and more, like, it is really hard for me to, like, be in the U.S. and see, like, like, I think there is a lot to criticize. Be like, yeah, like, I can appreciate some good things that I've, like, good experiences and good things in my life because of being in the U.S., but, like, it's also important to acknowledge, like, the healthcare here is shit. Like, the, like, justice system we have here is, like, such a joke, and, like, like, there is still a lot of, like, I mean, this is in a lot of places, but, like, still a lot of, like, transphobia and homophobia, like, going on, and I think that's a thing. But I think it's also important to notice, like, thinking about this critically everywhere, because I know I've heard a lot of people be like, believe that, when you're in a more progressive area, then it's okay, racism doesn't exist, homophobia or transphobia doesn't exist, and stuff. And, like, even from the smaller scale of me being from a small conservative town that was not friendly in those things to Austin, like, those things don't go away. Like, I think something people also need to recognize is even if you're like, this is better, like, you have to recognize, like, being in a more progressive area doesn't change the fact of how there's so many underlying things in our system and some overlying things that, like, are, harmful, and saying we're progressive is not the solution. I think because a lot of people will say that, but then don't look at, hey, well, in these ways it's not progressive. They, just keep being like, well, at least we're not in, like, the deep red of Texas, So, like, I think that's also a thing I've heard and thought about during the pandemic a lot.
So I did want to bring this up, and I think this is kind of the time to talk about this as well. So you are a member of the LGBTQ community. Yep. And you are the president of the LASA
Pride Alliance. So LPA, yeah.
And I wanted. So I personally am very, very. I grew up in a household that I don't want to say was against the LGBTQ, but definitely was not. I didn't really know it was a thing at the time. And I think it'd be interesting, really quick, one, to just sort of give a viewers of what is the LGBTQ community? What does it stand for, I guess? If you don't mind just sort of laying that out a little bit.
I mean, for me, it can be a pretty wide group. So you have more sexual and romantic orientations, right? And so, again, like, of who you're attracted to, romantically, we talk a lot about sexuality, but some people, like, have that mismatch with their romantic thing. So, for example, there's people asexual who don't feel sexual attraction, but they might feel romantic attraction, right? So, like, this includes a lot of identities, and basically people who are considered outside of, like, the hetero norm, right? So this includes, gay people, lesbians, and, bi, pan people, but it also does include ace people because of the fact that, like, it's still you're not having attraction in that way and stuff. So I think part of the thing is in the community and out of the community, there can often be debates about people straight passing and stuff. And I do want to clarify that even if someone has a straight passing relationship or on the surface looks like that, right? Like there still are LGBTQ plus, and I think considering
what type of relationship really quick? What was the
like heteronormative or straight relationships, right?
Okay.
So like people who don't identify as straight, right? And but also including straight looking, like in quotation marks, right? Looking relationships, because what people might think that is, like that doesn't mean everyone there is straight, right? Like someone could be ace, someone could be bi, pan, like various things, like you may be misgendering them accidentally, right? Like, so I think that's an important thing to say, like regardless of who your partner's with or not, like your like orientation is still your orientation. Like I think that's something that sometimes is a problem, specifically for like bi and pan and other people who have like attraction to more than the one gender, is that people will be like, oh, well, good news is if you're in a straight passing relationship you have privilege, which isn't like, that isn't always true, and you're still your identity, right? Which is like true if you think about it too with straight people. Like when you're in a relationship, that doesn't mean you suddenly like you know, that doesn't change your identity, right? You're with a person, you've chosen to like commit and be in a relationship with this person, but this doesn't mean that like if you weren't dating them, like your orientation would be different, right? Like you're still straight regardless of if you're dating someone or not. If you're not dating someone, that doesn't mean, oh, well, you're not straight anymore because you're not, you know, you're not in a relationship.
And really quick, just so I make sure, so asexual is you don't have
sexual attraction.
Pan? What is pansexual?
So pan is generally attraction to all genders, or a lot of people describe it attracted to the person, not the gender. So if you see Schitt's Creek, there's an episode there. It's a good show. It's a Canadian sitcom. Highly recommend it. I know it's at least on Netflix. So one of the characters is pan. So he explains that by being like, you know, well, I like the wine, not the label, right? So for a lot of pan people, that's what it would be like, that they like the person regardless of their gender identity. And then there's a lot of labels people might use to like do specific things, but bi and pan do fall in that category of like attraction to multiple genders. And so usually bi is like attraction to two or more genders, right? Which is also, I think, important, because this does not mean like bi people only date girls or boys. Like that, non-binary people still exist, and bi people may date non-binary people, because that's a thing. And also, it doesn't mean that there's only two genders. It just means like a bicycle. That doesn't mean there's only two wheels in the world. It just means in this case like that. Sorry, I don't know if that makes sense. And then gay and lesbian, like, you know, that's what it sounds like. And you have the same sort of thing for romantic attraction. So like aromantic is like, you know, no sexual attraction, right? And you'll have for the ace and aro community, which is like asexual and aromantic, like shortened, right? Levels. So there may be people who like may have sexual attraction or romantic attraction very rarely, or like only when they have a deep connection, which I think is important to point out in the way that, like, because I think a lot of people are like, well, everyone's demi-romantic, but like if you're demi-romantic, you would not, for example, go on a dating app, which is like one of the ways I think is a difference than you would see, right? Or if you're demisexual, like if you see someone, you would not, like, if you just met someone, you wouldn't have any of that like attraction. Though, like, I know a lot of asterisks and footnotes, but
right, yeah,
but like people, regardless of your identity, can notice other people are attractive. Like I think that's sometimes an issue with ace and aro people in particular. People will be like, but you're ace, and you're like, okay, but I can acknowledge someone is like aesthetically good looking, right? And stuff. So like that's like in terms of like orientations with like sexuality and romantic, like that's like a lot of the things that fall in there, right? Like people who aren't straight and stuff, and that doesn't, that what their identity is and their like connection to the community is not contingent on who they're in a relationship, right? Like it's more who you are, because again, a lot of people come out even when they're not in a relationship because they're, you know, they don't suddenly like change orientation or suddenly only have an orientation when they're dating someone, you know. And then if you're looking at gender, like you have trans and non-binary, and like trans can be an umbrella and so can non-binary. So like when we're looking under trans, right? So you might have binary trans people and non-binary trans person. So binary trans people would be like trans guys, trans girls, right? Or female to male, male to female. And then non-binary is also a big umbrella, which is like a thing because it's not necessarily just a third gender, right? Like I describe it as I identify as non-binary, but I don't necessarily believe that if I met another non-binary person, we're the same gender. Because usually I describe myself as more trans-masculine, right? So if there's a non-binary person who's more trans-feminine or is like agender.
And that's basically like you lean. How do I want to say this? And I'm going to screw this up horribly at times. Is it you're leaning towards masculine side?
So for me, like I'm definitely not a guy. Like I know that, but in terms of things that make me comfortable, or things that make me comfortable, is I do feel more comfortable with masculine things, masculine presentation, right? And stuff. And so like that's me. But a lot of people might have that difference. There might be someone else who feels more comfortable with the feminine things but still is non-binary, or someone who is agender, right? So for them, like there's not specifically a thing. Like when thinking about non-binary, like bisexual, like I don't think it's just like male female, right? Like for me it might be, if we were doing like neutral male female, like for me it might be easier for me to show my identity in that, but like I think it's a bigger thing of like a very broad spectrum, because you know people may have like there are, you know, gender fluid people, there are people whose like identity is like not like it's not one or the other or necessarily neither. Like I think that's a thing, like seeing it as an umbrella, and also understanding gender expression and gender identity don't match up necessarily, because I think that's a thing that people get confused, especially when it comes to trans people or non-binary people. You know, like again, like if a cis person can like express, they might wear more feminine things as a cis guy, right? But like their gender is still a guy. They just might express it, like have a different like expression, you know? So that's very long, but brief, concise, like the brief long of like overview of like of what you see in like trans non-binary community, of how we look at that.
So I wanted to ask this question, and I think this is a very important question to ask, and I'm very grateful for you kind of going into this, because this is an area that is really fascinating to me.
Yeah.
Just because it's in a very honest way, it's just so different than what, you know, when you're somebody, would I be considered a cis?
Yeah, you'd be cis het. That's how they would say if you're not trans, and if you're heterosexual, heteroromantic, like you don't identify as LGBTQ plus in any way.
And it's one of those things where it's just so, it's such a different, it's very hard to grasp. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And so I think it's gonna be, it's gonna be a very interesting set of questions.
Yeah.
And I want to let our viewers know that these are questions that, they're sort of the questions that I think we all kind of want the answers to, but I think we're sometimes hesitant to ask, and so I think this is going to be very, very valuable here.
Yeah.
And I truly think, I think it's going to be very beneficial. I was wondering if you could kind of tell that, sort of your story about how, you know, how sort of that process of, you know, sort of recognizing the fact that you were transgender, and also sort of in conjunction with that, how did you do it in sort of that environment that you were describing, that the more sort of small town conservative area?
So what I will say is, up until I was 13, or like the summer, like the beginning of summer break of 7th grade, I'd been living in Hutto, which is a small conservative town, and I spent most of my time there. So I went to school there and spent most of my time in my dad's house. And he was also very conservative Christian and stuff like that. So, you know, but again, my parents my parents were divorced, so I still saw my mom, which she lived.
And did they divorce when you were relatively young?
Yeah, so they divorced when I was 3. So, like, yes. So, like, again, but I also was raised in a household, you know, with my mom who was not ultra-conservative Christian, you know, like, Jewish and Reform Judaism in particular is very friendly in that way, and, like, specifically CBI is known for being very friendly in that way. And, like, the internet existed. So, like, you know, like, I had always seen myself as, like, the quote-unquote straight ally, right? Like, and so... Like, a longer story, my dad's an asshole in a lot of ways, more than just that. So, it was also then, like, 13, like, you know, right at the beginning of summer break, like, that's the last time I'd been, like, in his house living there, or in custody with him and stuff. So it was actually fairly soon after that, like, a few days, I was like, oh, I'm not straight, which for a lot of people seemed sudden, but it was more like being in that environment, right, like, even if I didn't fully consciously recognize it, like, part of that was, like, suppressing that as, like, a safety feature, right, because I knew, and I know from, like, conversations, because, again, I don't live with him, so this hadn't happened, but, like, I do know if I lived with him, he would have had, like, some form of conversion therapy, so, I, like, there was real danger there, and I knew that, and...
So I want to take it back a little bit,
yeah.
So you were young, you were living... partially with your father at the time.
Most of the time he had primary custody, so I went to school there. I spent most of my time there.
And at that time you would say you weren't conscious of the fact that you weren't.
Yeah, well, I'll say, like, again, I think hindsight is a thing. So looking back, like, one of the things, like, I mentioned, like, pan, right? So, like, I consider myself pan romantic, right? It's people regardless of gender, like, liking people regardless of gender, and I know when I was, like, again, I consider myself the really straight ally, which not all straight allies turn out to be, you know, LGBTQ+, but that is not an uncommon story necessarily to people. But, like, I remember when I was reading about different orientations and, like, I heard about pan, I was like, it's kind of weird not everyone's pan. Like, I mean, why do we care about gender? Like, I don't know, but I'm totally straight, you know? Yeah. Or, like, one time someone had asked about my orientation, and I was like, well, I'm not a lesbian, which it was not a false statement, but if you're a straight person, generally, if someone asks, you don't say, well, I'm not a lesbian.
Yeah.
And stuff. And so, like, there are things looking back, and I think even my dad, like, there were some behaviors that were also maybe, I don't know if tomboyish is the right word, but, like, you know, where I didn't, like, there was things where I tended not to fit the perfect, like, cis-het Christian girl mold, right?
Yeah.
Like, I think my dad saw some of that, and, like, looking back that, like, you know, I really didn't like hanging out with the girls at the youth group. Like, I like to hang out with the guys, and, like, I don't think he necessarily guessed trans, because, like, that was even farther out for him, but, like, I think things like that and other things, like, very much cued him into the fact that maybe I wasn't straight, you know? So, like, there was a lot of things like that where he, like, pushed that, and, again, not a great guy all around, so, like, there was a lot of things that, you know, like, for me, like, he was definitely never a safe person to come out to, and never someone who, like, I really cared a lot about, that I would be, like, cared a lot about in the way of being, like, you know, dealing with that homophobia and explaining that and stuff. And so when I soon after started living in his house, I actually also was with people who, you know, were LGBTQ+ and who were authentically themselves, and there was a situation and stuff, and, like, it came up about, like, you know, someone was like I could have had, like, some romantic attraction to, right? And being like, you know, I mean, if I wanted to date or kiss a girl, like, that's straight, and that person just looked at me like, because, again, if you hear that, like, cis-het people, like, but, like, again, in my head, like, there was that deeper seated, like, sort of denial thing. So, like, I came out to my mom, like, I didn't have a partner or anything, right, but, like, that was a thing, and just because, like, I knew I was going to Austin ISD for high school, regardless if I got into law school or not, but just because of the situation and, like, custody and legal, like, I wanted to just be at least in a school where I knew some people, right? So, like, I kind of, like, I didn't come out then, right? I only did at the end because I was like, I'm not going to ever see these people again. So, like, you know, so the whole thing, they're like, oh, that's okay. I'm like, I'm gay. And then there's, like, a whole silence where you're just like, please stop being homophobic, you know? Like, because there's things like that. And, like, I think it also, like, especially because it was near the end, and, like, I also wasn't dating anyone or something, or, like, it wasn't super spotlighted. Like, I definitely, like, did not face or would have faced as much
and
as,
that's
like,
that 8th grade year, correct?
Yeah, because I mean, the year before there was these two girls who like came out and were dating one another, and like that went very badly for them. So like, I don't think it's my school's climate change. It just happened like, I wasn't dating anyone. I wasn't in circles more of people, and like, again, because I knew I was leaving, like I gave less of a shit, because I was like, if there's people I want to be friends with and they're like, no, like, good news is like, I know they're likely not gonna talk to me anyway. So like, even though the few people, like, they were hesitant, but they were like somewhat okay, right, because of that situation of like kind of being blindly raised where it's like, oh, gay is bad, and not thinking about it and stuff. But in terms of trans identity, like, I think something that's important to note is, so I'm not going to say my dead name, but my dead name is a very common name still, but it was very common in my school and district. So there was a lot of people with my name. So if you just said my dead name, like, it would be a thing. So people called me my last name Clark. Like, most of the time I was called Clark, which, it's a last name and stuff. And if you're thinking of like, there's still sort of like, you could see some sort of masculine association of like Clark Kent, right? So like, and there were those jokes made. So like, most of my time, people who I spent most of my time with, not at home, called me Clark. So 8th grade this summer, like going to my freshman year, I was doing an AISD show and another show at the Vortex, right? And stuff. So these are people I've never met me, and I was the only one with my dead name. So there was no need for a nickname, but like, it was at that point when I started realizing like there's this wrong feeling when I heard my dead name. Like, I think it's hard to describe in that way, like, and I think it's so true. Like, it depends for people. Like, it's not that I hated the name as a name, right? Like, it's
more the association
it doesn't.
With the name.
Yeah, and I think that's something, like, some people do hate their dead name and would have hated it regardless, right? But like, there was just that disconnect, and like, I very much realized it then, because suddenly that was a thing. And like, again, now that I was fully out of that environment, like, there was other times where I was like, maybe I'm not exactly a girl, but like, I was having other things with like custody issues and like other like health things, right? Like, my 8th grade year, I had like that really bad foot injury that I needed surgery, so a lot of my time was spent dealing with that, which like,
so it wasn't the main, it wasn't something that you were necessarily focusing on.
Yeah, well, because like, again, and like, I had other serious like, mental health things, like I was having really bad depression, anxiety and stuff. So like, I'm not saying you can push transness away, because that's definitely not the case.
Right.
It's just the combination of still being in an environment where I know that would be hard, like, again, consciously and subconsciously knowing that in particular would be very difficult and would not end well, right? And stuff, and the combination of like all of these other things that were like so prominent and taking up all my attention, but like, at that time I was doing better with my mental health. I was in that situation, and like, realizing I was trans, like, there's a lot of times that I don't think people think of like internal transphobia, because it is like, it can be difficult and it can be hard, because it feels like the more difficult part is necessarily dealing with other people. And like, for me, there was the thing of, great, I just introduced myself, and now like to reintroduce myself, as trans, like, that was the thing, at the same time of being like, oh, well, I don't think I'm a girl, but it's fine, I just will never address it and it will be fine. Which is like, and I think, like, again, I can't speak for everyone, but that's not necessarily uncommon, right? To have that thing where like you have that sort of denial and you're like, unsure about it, but like I knew in a way, right? Like, there's a song by K-Town called This Is Home, which a lot of people like, specifically like trans guys, or maybe trans masculine people, or people who have like specifically like hair dysphoria and stuff, like things, because it's, like, I'll cut my hair to make you stare. Like, a lot of people use it as like a trans metaphor and thing. And like, for me, like, I listened to that song on repeat, because it was like in a situation where it was like, I didn't know who to talk to about it. I didn't really have a thing. Like, I didn't even know the people in my life very well. So it would be a weird thing for me to be like, hi, we just met. So also, I think I'm trans. Yeah. So like, for me, like, it was like having that song on repeat was like someone understanding me, And like, I knew this, like, over the course of the summer, like, it was more and more apparent to me, right? And like, but like, I didn't know how else to address it. And so like, I know starting my freshman year, like, I've done the slam poem a few times and stuff, but like stages of grief, not because like it's bad to be a trans person, because it's not. Like, I'm at the point where like, me being non-binary is not a shameful thing. Like, my biggest thing is dealing with dysphoria and transphobic people. Like, that's the thing that's upsetting, but like, that's not, my gender is not necessarily like it by itself is fine. It's just the other things around me that make it hard and stuff. But, like, you know, dealing with that and trying to figure out, like, how to deal with the world as a whole sometimes can be really hard with that. Because people, unintentionally or not, like, again, there's a lot of the world set up that's, you know, not necessarily friendly to non-binary people by trade. Or a lot of times where it's, like, really hard to, like, fully go into and, like, have, like, people understand what it means to, like, be trans and what it means to, like, talk around these things. So, like, I was like, oh, if I dress feminine enough, it will be fine. And that was not the case. So on National Coming Out Day, actually, which is in October, like October 10th generally, like, I came out to some of my friends, right? And so for me, coming out to people larger as a whole, because again, it is a situation where I knew some people from the summer, but not really, and meeting these people for the first time, and then, like, a few months later being like, by the way, I know you just learned my dead name, here's my new name, and pronouns and stuff. So what I found was helpful, and, like, this obviously, how it works for people is different, but I was out to people in LPA, and, like, it wasn't as much of a secret. It's just, like, you know, that awkwardness of trying to figure out how to say that, you know? So, like, I was also doing theater with one of the people at the time, so, like, you know, she would refer to me as Eli there, so it made it easier, so that way, you know, because we do group circles where we'd say, you know, name, pronouns, right? So, like, that was also a good thing about the theater group, is that it did give me that easier way to be like, hey, I'm Eli, they, them, right? And so that helped, and some people talked about it. So, like, it was hard, but I do find I also, like, went to my teachers and was like, hey, which is also a scary thing, right? Like, it can be hard, and I do think, especially, like, before school, emailing teachers about that can be helpful if you have that opportunity. Like, I've done that sometimes in the past, if you, like, have it enough in time to, like, you know, be like, hey, by the way, I'm going to be in your class, this is what my name says here, this is what I go by, here are my pronouns and stuff. But, like, yeah, so I did that, and, like, I did various changes at the time. Like, I got my hair cut short, you know, I started wearing a chest binder, which is what people who are, like, AFAB or assigned female at birth may wear, depending if they're trans guys or stuff, or if they have chest dysphoria. Like, not everyone on the trans guy or trans masculine thing may bind for one reason or another, right? Like, health issues, maybe some non-binary people don't have that dysphoria with it, right? Like,
wait, and sorry, I this is really how ignorant I am. What is a chest binder exactly?
So basically what it is it looks more like a tank top, but it acts as, like, a sort of way to, like, compress your chest to make it look flatter, right? So, like, if it's sort of like an extreme or sports bra, right? Like, in that, like, it holds your chest, but it also tries to make it look flatter and stuff, instead of just, like, holding your chest, if that makes sense.
And it basically, the idea is to give the person wearing it a more, I don't want to say masculine appearance, but to give a less feminine appearance.
Yeah. The idea to try to make the chest look flatter, not fatter. Or sometimes, like, again, it also depends on the person, so it may try to make it more organized to look more, like, muscular instead of, like, rounded and stuff. So, like, you know, but yeah, like, the purpose of it is to try to make your chest look flatter and to, like, make it look or seem, like, less feminine, you know. So, like, yeah, that's true. And
are they sorry, and
you're good.
Once again, if this is too far, definitely cut me off. Is it painful to wear? Is it
So they don't recommend wearing it for more than, like, 8 hours at a time or in a day. There's various things. There's various people who have some false information online about it because they're, like, against chest binders. It can be harder if you're wearing it for a while, and if it's very important to have, like, a binder from the right company that fits, because, for example, if you're like, oh, Ace bandages, like, that's bad, like, that hurts your chest, like, that hurts your ribs, and so, like, there's various ways of
circulation issues.
Yeah, well, like, yeah, so generally you don't want to bind for too long, and you want it to be the right size, because, again, if not, like, it could, if you do something wrong, if you use a bad method, like, it could hurt your ribs, it could cause issues with, like, skin elasticity, or it could be, like, have some sort of, like, back pain and stuff. So, like, there is, like, it can be more uncomfortable for a while, but, like, for trans people, a lot of times, like, that is the better option, right? Like, sorry, can you pause for 1 second to tell my stepdad, be like, we're gonna be done soon, because I want to tell him that, so he's not like, hey,
What are we doing?
we're almost done. Yeah. I planned ahead. We're not gonna be living here all night. No, I promise.
Well, it was my bad. I was like, oh yeah, the Austin Library's open, and then I checked the website.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things, but.
Well, no, this is crazy. I had no idea. Like, this is me being completely honest. I had no idea chest binders even existed at this point.
Yeah,
so
well.
This is very, very interesting.
Well, because it's a thing. Like, yeah, you don't hear about it as much, and it is a thing that it is. Like, that's not a common thing. Like, I didn't even know those were a thing until I was like, this is an issue I'm having. How would I try to fix this issue? But, like, yeah, so, like, in terms of brands, and again, because safety and sizing, like, GC2B is the one that a lot of people go to and is good. You know, there's a place here in Austin, apparently, they're online, called, like, Flaunt, but instead of a U, it's a V and stuff, which sound good, but they're basically all sold out at things in most sizes. So, like, if you're trying to get one right now, like, I would not recommend trying to get it at this exact moment, but, like, those are two places I know are more reliable. Like, don't go on Amazon, like, don't do things like that, because those are generally not actually necessarily made in mind and understanding what they're for, because some people will be like, lesbian chest binders, and that's not what they're for. Like, people, like, conflating ideas and not understanding, like, no. Yeah, but, so yeah, like, yeah, so that was a thing. I got some more masculine clothes, right, and stuff, and so, for me, one of the things that, like, I also think is important, like, as a non-binary person that's not always talked about is, I noticed, because, again, I'm more transmasculine. Like, I'm definitely not a guy, but in terms of comfort and things like that, like, I am more comfort with masculine things, right? And so I noticed people would, like, you know, still use she, her pronouns and stuff, and sometimes people would slip up and say he, and being called he versus she was, like, not as bad, right? So I would say they, he pronouns and saying I prefer they, them. But he, him is also okay. But the problem is, like, people, again, I don't think people are necessarily doing it on purpose or realizing the issue behind it, but a lot of people would disregard that and only use he, him, to the point where I had a professional who, again, she asked me, and, like, there was treatment of care, right? And I told her, you know, I'm non-binary, I prefer they, them. Like, I was very clear about that. And, you know, the entire time she just used he, him, but the problem became that she had told my parents that I was a trans guy and I was using they, them to transition to he, him. Which
so
is,
there was a miscommunication. Yeah.
well, and again, because it was like, I had very clearly said that, but, like, you know, people hadn't listened, and I think it's, because there is, in some ways, where people, you know, might say that it's easier for them to do binary trans people or binary pronouns, even though we use they, them. Like, we use they, them constantly. I think it's just a lot of people have in their head that it's difficult and don't realize how, like, you use it consciously without thinking. I think some people don't think about that, and so then when they have to, like, discuss it consciously, they are, like, suddenly, you know, like, oh, I can't do that. But, you know, they can. You know, using they right there, that could be a singular thing, you know? So, like, you know, like, that's when I started to switch to they, them, because that's really what I prefer, you know? And, like, as much as, like, it's easier for people to, like, act like I'm a guy, like, that's not... It's just not right for me. Like, it's okay to be a guy. It's okay to be a trans guy and use he, him pronouns, but, like, that's not my gender. So, like, for me, it was very important to be seen. So, like, I think a lot during the pandemic being able to have, like, they, them and other things, and I don't have it on me now, but, like, I have they, them pronoun pins, you know? Like, I think that's something I've been trying to do more, so that way it's like, you know, listen, this is my identity. I know it's easier for people to act like this, but, like, it's not... It's still hurting me. Like, it's not as bad as being called she, her, right? But then again, I'm still in a situation where I'm being misgendered, regardless if people have that intention or not. So, like, I think that was a thing for me, and I think, you know, I'm a lot more secure in my identity now, being like, these are my pronouns. Yeah, and being like, what I'm okay wearing, what I'm okay not. Because, again, even non-binary people, a lot of people see as, like, androgynous, more masculine, and, like, for me that actually does match my gender more, but that's not true for everyone and stuff. And I think also, like, there's a difference of things that, hey, this is, like, dysphoric, you know, like, that disconnect, right, between my gender, like, things that I wear that, like, for me, dresses, long hair, like, that makes me dysphoric, regardless of other people. But, like, sometimes I think it's fun to play around with lipstick shades and stuff. And the only issue is when people use that to be like, well, you can't be trans because you're doing that, which is like,
yeah.
Which, again, because gender expression and gender identity aren't the same, but also, like, I'm non-binary, so that also, there's that's why it's like important to see it as a umbrella and not as a third label, right? Because the entire point is you're not in a binary. So seeing non-binary is like multiple people can be non-binary, but it's not one gender. It's an umbrella, it's a category, and like me and one non-binary person, as I said, like we may not share the same gender identity. And so being like, oh, you have the same gender would often be... Yeah, most of the time. Like, I know a lot of non-binary people, and I would say I don't believe I share the same gender identity as a lot of them because of, like, how it differs. So, yeah, I mean, it was difficult. And, like, you know, there's still other things. Like, I know things in the future, like medically transitioning, like, that's not always important to people. Like, it depends, person to person, but, like, that's a thing for me, you know, so, like,
sorry to interrupt, so you're thinking about doing...
So there's various transitions, right, and various parts. So for me, like, what I see myself is, and again, this is person to person, right, so for me, like, testosterone is a thing some people do, so, like, I would specifically want to do that to the point where I drop my voice, but not enough to, like, you know, like, people can do that where it's like somewhat of that range instead of being like the full thing. So I wouldn't fully be like, I wouldn't get like the male pattern baldness or things like that. But like I would like lower voice, and I mean it would be like a second puberty, which is yeah, it's a thing. It's an adventure, yeah. Yeah, like that's like an unfortunate thing in some ways, but like it's a lot better to be, you know, going through puberty if it's more closely to what your body aligns to. And like for me, top surgery, which is like the sort of thing of like, again, dealing with chest dysphoria, so, you know, similar, like, you know, people who might need like a mastectomy for like breast cancer, it could be that, but except, you know, you're doing it because of the dysphoria and stuff. And so it still is often covered as a medical procedure because it's like for gender dysphoria, because it's not just like cosmetic, because it is that thing and stuff. And so like a lot of people will do that, not everyone, but like, so like for me, those are the main important things. And like very soon I plan to change like my name legally and stuff, and like gender marker to, I mean, I hope to be, my plan's going to be to a state that has like the gender X marker and stuff. And if somehow that can't happen, like changing into male would not be as bad, but like I am trying to, that's like part of the reason I'm not doing it right. Yeah, which is like
non-binary as opposed to
male. So like that's why I'm like, part of the reason why I'm like waiting till I leave Texas, because almost all the places I'm looking at have that option, because, you know, because Texas is not trans friendly. Like I think that's also a thing. Is a lot of people are like, oh, Austin, but like understanding that like Texas is still Texas. Like the transphobic laws don't go away just because some people in this neighborhood will use my pronouns, right? Like I think that's an important thing. So, and again, like, yeah, doing that and like living my adult life as my gender, like I think that's important. And I think like it can be hard to come out like at first, and it can be difficult. And like obviously if you're in an unsafe position at your home, right? Like again, I don't think anyone's less trans if it takes them a while to come out, if it takes a while to know. Because again, a lot of people, like you'll have these old people who don't realize they're trans or gay till they're like elderly, and you might be like, well, how do you know? And I think it's similar to what I was when I was in Hutto, right? Like subconsciously or consciously, like you have that thing where you're like, oh, trans is wrong. And then as you like move up, it's like being able to do that. So like it's difficult, I think, at times, but like it's definitely worth it. And I think like younger Eli, like telling myself, being like that, you know, no, you're not just gonna be like, well, I'm not a girl, but no one will ever know ever. Like that's an unrealistic thing. Like I think it's common for people to go through, and I don't think that makes anyone less trans, but I think it's important to acknowledge, like, you know, that's how you are. Like it's a journey and stuff, and like the important thing is getting is feeling secure in you and feeling comfortable in being like who you are. So yeah.
Wow, that's fantastic. I think it's, you know, it's a very I mean it's a very interesting journey, and I think I'm really very happy for you that you got to this point.
Yeah.
Because I know that I could only assume, you know, it was tough getting here.
Well, yeah, it took a lot of time, and yeah.
And I think, you know, I think that your journey is not fully done yet. You know, I think you're, you know, and I wish you luck.
Thank you. Yeah.
You know, kind of, kind of moving
Yeah.
forward and progressing in that.
Yeah.
And I think
Thank you.
I think it's I just think it's something that I don't think people such as myself will be able to say like, yeah, man, I totally understand. But I think it's something that it's very interesting to hear, and it's for people such as myself to do what we can to create a supportive environment is paramount.
Yeah,
and I just think it's so. I'm happy that I'm glad that you're not still in the box.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. I appreciate it. And I will say something that I think, like food for thought, or something that I think cis people can do when thinking about it, is a lot of times I think people look at it being like, well, how would it be if like I suddenly felt like was a girl, right? But like I think a better way is to think about it like, what would it be like if people kept insisting you're a girl, like as like kept like thinking about it the opposite way, like, right? What would it be like if people, were calling me she, her, if people were seeing me as a girl, like thinking about it in that way, I think can be somewhat more helpful in that thing of thinking about, like, again, not being like, well, what if I was another gender? I'd be like, what if society, like, what if I was facing a thing where people kept seeing me as not my gender? Like, I think that's a better way that some cis, like, I think that can be a way some cis people can look at that and think about what that means and stuff, and think about it. It's not like, oh, what if I was that, like, what if you're in a world where it's like, people don't automatically see your gender as that, like, or if you have to like kind of fight or be like, hey, actually, like, I think that's the way to think about it. And I think it's important, listen to trans people, like, work on pronouns and stuff, and like, I think that's important. Yeah, listening to trans people. And I think one of the things that like, like messing up on pronouns, like not making a big deal about it, not over apologizing, like, I think that's that. And there's a lot of trans people online too that like can talk about that, but like, yeah, I think those are important things. Important to like understand what you can best do, right? But yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Well, we've been recording for
hot sec,
a hot minute.
Yeah.
As always, I feel like time always flies.
Yeah.
With these podcasts. I just want to say, is there anything else you want to drop on the audience before we give this a wrap?
No, I think I'm good for now. Yeah. Thanks for listening and/or watching.
Oh yeah. Next time we got to get the poetry. Next
I got
will
time.
Poetry,
yeah.
So.
It's great.
Alrighty. Well, thank you very much for watching, Eli. Always a pleasure. And this was awesome.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
That was awesome.
Yeah.
No, I was.